This podcast episode, Mack Unveiled, where several people who knew him well tell a few of his stories, was released on November 16th, 2023. As this is re-released today on March the 19th, 2025, it has been 10 years since his death. In remembrance of this iconic leader and to celebrate his life on this special anniversary, here it is again, for those who knew him and for those who wish they did. After 20 years of working for myself in the funeral business, I spent the next 23 years working for the largest funeral company in America, Service Corporation International, with its home office in Houston, Texas, whose annual revenues are over $4 billion, operating in 44 states, 8 Canadian provinces, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico, through over 1,900 locations, 25,000 associates employed. I consider myself very fortunate to have been one of the 25,000. I was also fortunate to get to know hundreds, if not thousands, of wonderful people across the country who do an incredible job of serving families at the worst time of their lives, while making sure families take care of the business of death before they face the agony of it. The funeral profession is an honorable way to make a living, and I am very proud to have been a part of it. It is certainly not for everyone. But in my 23 years, the corporate funeral world afforded me another opportunity. I was able to meet and rub shoulders with the senior leaders who are the brains and the heart behind the machine called SCI. I found incredible human beings who were intelligent, thoughtful, and upright. I saw true leadership firsthand and personally. One of those senior leaders who greatly impacted my life and the life of an untold number of others was a man by the name of Steve Mack. He was an imposing figure who seemed larger than life. He was a bona fide New Yorker who was transplanted to Houston to help guide a huge company at a critical time. They could not have picked a better man than Steve Mack. After somewhat of a shaky start that you'll hear about, I somehow found myself directly reporting to Steve for most of my 23 years at SCI. I interacted with him almost daily. The interactions could be at his office on the top floor of the home office, or at results-oriented business meetings and reviews, traveling with him across the country on a company jet, over dinner in one of his favorite places in New York City or Houston or who knows where, long walks at night through places like Nashville or Baton Rouge, and too many telephone conversations to even begin to measure. Sometimes I missed him when he called me. I'm glad I saved this one, not for the content, but just a reminder of my interactions with him.
Hey, Bruce, it's Steve. I'm just curious why they got to wait till the end of June. I'll just ask Tidwell. I'm going to see you in a meeting in a few minutes. Okay, take care. Bye.
This message arrived.
Steve Mack and I could not have been more different. A New Yorker with the accent to go with it, and a South Georgia undertaker with an accent to go with that. He loved New York City. I loved Reynolds, Georgia. You will learn in this podcast that Steve had a knack for seeing in others what most could not see. When he saw the potential of a person, he seemed to be determined to do everything in his power to develop that person. I am certainly one of the recipients of his perception and development. Steve worked hard at getting to know people in his circle on a personal level. There would be many conversations, not only about business, but about personal things. His favorite setting was in an Italian restaurant. When you were lucky enough to be having dinner with Steve in one of his favorite restaurants in New York City, you know you were in for an unforgettable evening. When my wife was having health problems, Steve would call just to check on her. After a few of those calls, I gave Steve her number so he could call her directly. My wife loved Steve Mack. She could not believe that a man with his responsibilities would call her to chat and just to check on her. Anyone that worked for him or with him can relate to what I'm saying. During my tenure with SCI, Steve was not only my boss, who turned out to be my friend, but he was the heart and soul of this very large company. When he passed away in 2015, the newspaper called him a giant of American funeral service. He was certainly that, but he was also a giant to those who knew him well. During the next hour, you will hear from several senior leaders of SCI talking about the impact of Steve Mack in their lives. Mind you, my guests are very successful people who had or have large roles with this company and are leaders to many. You're about to be entertained and inspired by their stories. In telling the stories and remembering him, they will remove the veil of Steve Mack and see him just as he was. In doing so, you will hear real-life lessons about true leadership. There will be a boat full of lessons here in the stories they tell. Steve always taught us that no matter what we covered in a meeting, the people at the meeting should leave with only 2 or 3 action items. If you gave them more, nothing would ever get done. You will have many items to choose from listening to this podcast. If you want to be a better leader or even a better person, I suggest you choose just 2 or 3 and begin to practice those things. My guests certainly knew him well, and they all are better leaders and humans because of his leadership. There are many others who would be just as qualified or even more qualified to talk about Steve Mack, and the list of lessons would only get longer, but we have only so much time in one podcast. You will learn that almost 9 years after his passing, he is still missed greatly. Though he is alive in heaven, he is also alive on earth because he is alive in all those he impacted. His legacy continues to be the heart and soul of the company he loved. This is Steve Mack Unveiled.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.
I met Steve Mack in the fall of 1998. The year before, I had sold my small-town funeral homes to another company, and 8 months later, they sold their company to the largest funeral company of them all, SCI. To be honest, I was not a happy camper. I had several opportunities to do something different, but in the end, I chose to stay with this very large company. That turned out to be one of the greatest decisions of my life. I came on my new company as an area manager, which meant I would be responsible for a group of funeral homes in Georgia. A month or so after SCI took over, I was called to a meeting in Atlanta. I was told I would meet the big boss from New York City. When I got there, the room was set up with U-shaped tables. There must have been 60 to 70 people there. I knew only a couple of them. Steve Mack was sitting at the head table in the middle, and it was not difficult to figure out which one he was. And there was no doubt he was the boss in that room. He was the most intimidating person I'd ever seen in my life. He wore his glasses down on his nose, and he peered over them as he spoke in his New York City accent. It seemed every time I looked at him, he was staring at me. I was trying to be inconspicuous, but it didn't seem to be working. As far as for the content of that meeting, I don't remember any of it 25 years later. But I do remember being in the room with Steve Mack for the first time. By the way, at some point during that day-long meeting, it dawned on me that every man in that room was wearing a dark business suit, except me. I was wearing khaki pants and a sports coat with a colored shirt and no tie. So I learned that is why I was getting the stare from Steve Mack. I didn't get the dress code memo, or I suppose back then it was a fax. But wearing the wrong clothes that day turned out to be a good thing for me. And the fact that I talked with a serious Southern accent was another good thing. Steve Mack would remember me, and he would eventually change my life. I think everybody that rubbed shoulders with Steve Mack remembers when they first met him and the impression they got.
I'm Scott Young. I met Steve in 1991 when I was asked to relocate from Memphis, Tennessee, as a manager of Memphis Funeral Home to run the Revenue Services Department in the Atlantic region. And Steve took over the Atlantic region. I moved to Richmond, Virginia on Sunday, not knowing what the next decade, 2 decades of my life would be like. Did not know Steve at all. I moved on Sunday. Steve came to Richmond on Monday. I met him for the first time. Here's this gregarious New Yorker, big smile, handsome-looking gentleman, very professional. And he sits down in this long conference room and he meets with the entire Atlantic region staff. And he sits and he goes, I don't know much about the South, because the Atlantic region basically had North Carolina, Virginia, etc.,
Right.
Washington, D.C.
All right.
Steve began to go through his little history with the company. And they said, I want to learn about what each of you are doing. He goes, I'd like to start with you, Scott. And I said, Mr. Mack, I apologize. I just moved here yesterday. This is my first day in this office. He pushes himself away from the conference table. He said, what have you been doing?
Sounds
And
just
I'm
like him.
I said, what have I gotten myself into? This is not going well. And we go to dinner that night. And we're walking to the tobacco company in downtown Richmond. And he pulls me aside down this alley. He said, today was good. He said, what I said to you is pretty funny, right? I said, not really. I said, I was sweating like a pig. And pigs don't sweat.
Steve Tidwell was a close friend of Steve's and Steve's peer in Houston as the senior vice president of the company. Steve, when did you first meet Steve Mack?
Yes, so I've known Steve Mack even before joining the company, and he was always such a stately figure, hair perfectly placed, nice suit and tie. But I think the first time I met him when joining SCI, we were in the FBO at the Tampa airport. He made such an impression on me about knowing the business, about having grown up in the business. In fact, our career paths had been very similar. And I was drawn to him and his thoughtfulness, the way he listened, and the way he responded to questions.
Yeah, he was kind of an imposing figure too, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. There were times you'd say, this is a gentleman that I do not want to cross.
It's kind of the impression he got, but the truth is he was a teddy bear when you got to know him, but that is really true.
Yeah, no bigger heart than Steve Mack.
This is John Rufero, and I'm recalling the first time I met Steve Mack. It was actually in 1973.
Wow.
At the time, I was an assistant manager at Walter B. Cook in 85th Street in Manhattan. And Steve was transferred to my location from his former location where he was working, which was Boyd Funeral Home in Babylon, Long Island. Steve was transferred in to be a funeral arranger, a non-union position. It was a union funeral home, but it was a very busy funeral home, doing approximately 100 calls a month, and we needed another arranger. And at the time, I was doing the scheduling, so I met with Steve, and we went over what the schedule would be and so on and so forth. And the funny part of it was we did kind of strike up a good relationship, but within the first 2 months, I sat down with Steve 7 different times to make 7 different schedule changes, and we kind of laughed about it. I kind of apologized, and he understood, and he was very easy to get along with, and we developed a very strong relationship from that point forward. So something I never forget. So that was kind of our first laugh together.
So this is Vern Pixley, and my first encounter with Steve was one from a distance where I didn't meet him, but I was in the same room with him, the same event, and I honestly don't even remember where it was or what it was, but I remember thinking something along the lines of Don Corleone, and this has got to be the Godfather.
Yeah.
But my first memorable encounter with him in a conversation was at a meeting that we had, and we were in Columbus, Ohio, of all places, and it was at the time we were divesting of a lot of companies, and I very sheepishly went to him and said, "Hey, if you're ever going to sell Pixley Funeral Home, I want to be the one to buy it, but I want you to know how much I like what I'm doing, and I like working for the company, and I respect your leadership, and I just don't want anybody else to get our family business. So if it's ever going to be sold, I want to buy it."
Right.
And he, it's like he looks into your soul when you talk to him, and in his way, thank you for telling me that, and I'll keep that in mind.
And he did keep it in mind, I promise you.
Yeah.
I'm Jerry Hurd. So the first time that I met Steve Mack, well, first of all, there was this persona and this aura in the company about this man that was a giant in the organization. And so I had heard about him, and I had met him at events and things like that, mainly just hello, but Steve would always step forward. He always paid attention to each person. He was extremely personable and would come forth and say hello and always want to know how you're doing, how your family was doing, and interact with people on a basis like that. But probably the first time that I ever spent much time with him, I was running sales for the Gulf and Houston regions. Steve decided to come to a meeting that I was having. I had my sales directors in town, and Steve wanted to come to the meeting. And I learned a really valuable lesson out of this. But Steve came and he sat at the meeting and listened and never really said much. He really just sat there the whole time and listened. He made a few comments about what we were working on or what I was asking people to do or the direction that we were going. And he made a comment before he left about if he could get everybody to be doing those things, how powerful it would be for the company. Well, what came out of this, the company reorganized, and I ended up reporting directly to Steve and working with him and officing next to him for the next 6 or 7 years, however long it was. And I'm convinced it was because of that meeting. So He came that day, and the lesson for me was you need to always be on your game because people are always watching.
Steve and I weren't necessarily the first ones there in the morning, but we were absolutely the last two to leave. And many times
That's true.
we would sit in his office and my office and talk about life in general. I found him to be interested in me, and I was interested in him.
Yep.
And we just became very close very quickly. I think it has a lot to do with our backgrounds and our pedigree of coming into the business and how we got to where we were. And it goes back to that thing that Steve Mack just had this incredible heart, and he wanted to know the people that he worked with and wanted to know them well. I had a group of people, it might have been NFDA in Las Vegas, and we had hosted a group dinner at one restaurant, and our restaurant was probably 3 miles down the road. But in Vegas, there's this depth perception that you just say, well, our hotel's just right there. Let's just walk. So Steve and I started walking, and we walked, and we walked, and we walked, and we decided to take a shortcut, and we climbed over a concrete wall. And then we came to a place where there was about an 8-foot fence. And he said, so I'm going to have to scale the fence to get back to my bed tonight. He said, we'll call in an Uber. And that's what we did. But just the way he stood there and said that.
So I remember being in one restaurant, and I honestly don't remember whether it was in New York or Houston, where we were having dinner. It was an Italian restaurant, and we went around the table, and it was, I think we were having dinner. Doherty was with us, and it was my direct report, so the managing directors and I,
Right.
with Steve. And Doherty always had a question like, what's your favorite whatever? And this happened to be, what's your favorite movie? So we went around the table, got to Tim Ross. Tim Ross said, my favorite movie is The Sound of Music. And we went around and we were all giving Tim a hard time. The Sound of Music. I mean, come on. What about, Rocky or Die Hard or, there's got to be something, Braveheart. There's got to be something better than Sound of Music. And we got to Steve, and he goes, yeah, maybe surprised, but my favorite movie is The Sound of Music, too. And I was like, oh, it got a little awkward.
That's
so,
great.
So let me fast forward. Remember when Carrie Underwood did the stage version of Sound of Music?
Yes, I do. It was on TV.
So
yeah.
I was in Houston, and I had remembered it was Steve's favorite movie, and I said, hey, Carrie Underwood is doing The Sound of Music tonight? And he goes, no, really? I said, yeah. He goes, oh, okay. So, I went around, did my business. So about, 4:00, my phone rings. He goes, hey, why don't you grab Pisano and come over to my house for dinner, and we'll watch The Sound of Music.
That's great.
I said, okay. So you'll love this, Bruce. I pick up Pisano. We drive over to Mack's house. He's got a big, thing of sushi that he picked up on his way home from work because Barbara was out of town. She was in New York visiting her parents, I think. And then the three of us, it was cold. It was 45 degrees out. The three of us went out on his deck. He gave Pisano and I coats because we didn't have any coats. We were curled up on these chairs out on his patio, smoking cigars, watching The Sound of Music, and he knew every word of every scene in the whole movie. And I just said to myself, if somebody had a picture of this, I can't believe we didn't take a picture. Yeah. It would have been classic.
He was a well-rounded guy. I flabbergasted that his favorite movie was The Sound of Music. It's typical Steve Mack. stuff, though. It really is. It's typical. That's just he surprised you in a lot of stuff that he did. Talk a little bit about, we used to work hard, but we also played golf. I remember being in Detroit with you and Lee. I don't know if there's anybody else. It may have just been me and you and Lee at that point. I working for him, I think, wasn't it?
It was.
Lee had to have a random drug test, and I'll never forget, Steve was out there practicing his golf swing in the parking lot. He had his driver out swinging while Lee was in there peeing in the cup or whatever. You remember that?
Oh, I do. I remember it vividly. He called me and said, "Hey, how's the weather in Michigan up in September?" I said, "Oh, it's beautiful. Crisp days and sunshine, and it's really nice." He goes, "I think maybe we ought to have a meeting." I said, "Okay, that'd be great. Have you come up?" He goes, "Yeah, and we'll bring Lee and Bruce." And I don't know if you remember this or not, but I picked you guys up at the airport. And he said, and maybe we play a little golf. So we did play golf twice.
Yeah.
And I picked you guys up, and Steve's in the front seat. We're riding in the Suburban, and he goes, "Lee, we were coming down I-94 into the city." He goes, "Lee, I'll bet you thought you'd been in a knife fight by now in Detroit." He's like, I'm not scared to be here.
He was very intimidating. When we used to travel together, people thought he was Tony Soprano.
Right.
And we used to get on elevators and people would stare at him.
Yeah.
And, but the persona of what people had, the visual of what they had was not what he was.
I had a meeting of my team and all the market directors and the managing directors. Steve came in. We had the guy that had done Kyle. God, I can't remember his name. Kyle. He had no arms and no legs, and he had climbed Mount Kilimanjaro.
Oh yeah, I know who you're talking about. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So he made a presentation via WebEx at our meeting. We asked him questions, and it was very emotional. I also had the candidate, Mike Duggan, who was running for mayor of the city of Detroit, came in and talked to us about overcoming obstacles because he had been, they'd tried to throw him off the ballot so many times because he hadn't done one thing or another and qualified. And he ended up winning the election, and he came and spoke to us about overcoming obstacles. Great, just a great touch. And he's still the mayor of Detroit.
Right. Oh.
And so after the meeting, about a week later, I get a handwritten envelope, and you can always tell Steve's writing. Handwritten envelope from him, a yellow sticky note on a check that said, "Maybe you could make this contribution to the mayor candidate's campaign."
That's typical.
Yeah, right out of he was touched by his presentation and followed up like that.
You hit on something but these little personal notes he would send you, always handwritten, and that was a touch that he had that not many people do. I mean, it was a word of encouragement or congratulations or whatever. He was a master at that, wasn't he?
I've saved every one of them.
Oh yeah, me too. Absolutely.
There's a story where the meeting is going down in the heritage rooms. There are no windows, so you lose track of time. All of a sudden, it's about day 2, and it's 7 p.m., and he had a buffet brought in. And Dave said, "Steve, we need to get these guys out of here. I mean, they need some air. They need to eat." And he says, "No, we're going to have these sandwiches, and we're going to keep plowing through it." Finally says, "There's this steakhouse down the road that I think we ought to go." Anyway, that went back and forth, and so finally Steve just dropped his spoon and he said, "Are you getting a cut or something from this guy at a steakhouse down the street?" I've never seen anybody work harder trying to get us to go to a steakhouse.
I was working with a consultant as well, and we were working on leadership programs and things like that. And Steve had to sit down with me, and he said, "John, really, really concerned. I really want people to enjoy their jobs, to really feel fulfilled, actually kind of be happy about, what they're doing for a living and so on and so forth. And I want to start this quality service program, and I would like you to kind of head it up. He said that seems like something that's kind of in your ballywick and something you'd enjoy and be successful with it. And I said, yeah, I would really enjoy that. And the funny part of it was I was in revenue service driving revenue, and at the same time talking to managers and other people in leadership positions about providing an environment where people really wanted to come to work. They felt part of it. They felt appreciated and all that. So some time had passed, and Steve called me to his office, and he said, I want to talk to you a little bit about the quality service skills, the employee morale program that you're working on and doing a good job. He said, but I just wanted to remind you that we are in business to make a profit. Now, if we can make a few people happy along the way, that's fine too. So
There was a group meeting, and this gentleman names will stay out of this, but he had some really bad results. I mean, there was really nothing on this gentleman's income statement that was good. Volume was down, average was down, costs were up, pre-need production was down. But he delivered his message with such enthusiasm. Steve had the glasses down the tip of his nose, and he said, "Are you done?" He said, "Yes, sir." I have to tell you, I've never felt better about crappier results in my entire life.
Bob Pisano was such an important part because there was so much analytics and so many things that were going on. At that point, it was Bob. Bob was kind of his right-hand man to help with a lot of the analytics stuff. Dave Hass was running cemeteries for him, and me sales, and all of our job was to support you and Lee and the other folks that ran all the organizations, and Bob was the one that always kept him on time and kept him going and so forth. And there was a lot of change, a lot of stuff that was going on, and there'd be meetings about all of that kind of stuff. And we'd get to a hotel, and Bob would tell Steve, he's like, "Okay, so let's go. Everybody go to your room, drop your bags, call your spouses, and let's meet down here in 5 minutes?"
And Steve would look like, what?
Yeah. And Steve, we were meeting at the home office one night, and it was probably 9 o'clock, and we were reorganizing, and Bob Pisano, I think he had gotten in the car with Steve, and Steve was driving him around front to get to his car, and the door opened up, and I don't think Bob wanted to get out. And I think Bob said, "Okay, let's recap." And Steve's like, I can't recap. I can't take anymore. It's like I've had enough.
So one of the things that I enjoyed most with Steve were the one-on-one conversations we had over a cigar. And it was so funny because he would say, "Are you having a cigar tonight?" And I'd say, "Yes." And he'd say, "I think I know a place." Wherever we were,
right.
Whether it was, we were in Las Vegas and he knew a place. We were in North Carolina and he knew a place. We were in New York and he knew places.
Yeah.
So I have so many fond, memories of the conversations that we had together over a cigar. He always had a great place. One of my favorites was at a meeting that I had held with one of my teams early, and we went to the New York Athletic Club and stayed there, had dinner downtown, and then after dinner, Steve and I walked around Manhattan.
Yep.
Outside. It's kind of a rainy, cold night, and we just had phenomenal conversation.
Right.
And it was always personal. He was always interested in what was going on and about you personally.
Yeah.
And he cared a lot about the people that worked with him. And I think that just, when I think of Steve, I think of loyalty. He was a loyal person.
An incredibly kind human being. And he legitimately cared. I mean,
Yeah.
he always knew that for people to be their best at work and to do the best they could they could be, they had to be their best at home. I remember many evenings I'd walk in his office and say, I'm leaving, and I sat down in the chair. Dinner may have been ready at home. It may have been 6:00, and I was going to be home at 6:30 for dinner. And I remember still sitting in the chair at 9 p.m. that night because I went in to say goodnight, and we'd sit down and have the most incredible conversations about business, about life, about, just about what things were happening.
Today we talk about taking the complex and making it simple. He really had a mastery of that. So if you're facing a human resource issue and someone says this person must be terminated, and someone says this person, do this, do that, Steve Mack's response would typically be, well, you can fire them, but if you don't, you can rest assured they'll never make that mistake again.
Yep.
And there was so much truth in that, is that if it was, granted, if it was a serious thing, it had to happen, but
Right.
someone made a human mistake and you give them a second chance, Steve was convinced that person would never make that same mistake twice.
Yep.
And he was very right.
I think he was absolutely right. And I picked that up from him, and sometimes I'd go to bat for people that somebody else wanted to get rid of. He also had another, speaking of HR, he had another HR phrase that he used. What was it?
Oh, yes. He said Joe Hayes is our, at the time, was our business value and ethics lawyer. And he went around the country and made a beautiful presentation about those things. And what you should do or you shouldn't do, and what about your ethics and your values and so forth. And his plane was delayed coming into a meeting, so it ended up being canceled. So Steve stood up and he said, well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry that Joe Hayes will not be here. His plane's been canceled, so I'm going to do the business value and ethics training myself, and then we'll have some time to move on to other topics. It's really simple. If it's chipped, cracked, or broken, we don't use it, we throw it out. Keep your hands to yourself, tell your dirty jokes at home. Any questions?
He took a two-hour presentation and reduced it to that sentence.
Now that's keeping it simple.
But that's kind of the way he was. I mean, that's just the way he was, very much to the point. But he was such a people person. He would spend money to do the right thing.
He absolutely.
I don't ever remember him even hinting for anybody to do what was not ethically or morally right. Period. I learned quickly with Steve that you could come to him with any problem you were facing or whatever you were dealing with out here, and we had plenty of them. Mm-hmm. But I learned to never go to him without a solution to what my problem was. I would have the problem, and sometimes I'd have two solutions, but I'd never go, because I remember early on he said, you think through that and let's talk again. And so, in other words, he was empowering me and causing me to make decisions on my own, and I had to do that. He had to have people making decisions to even be successful. He couldn't make them all, right?
That's very true, and I think as the company scaled up, that became so abundantly clear to him that he had to surround himself with people that could make good decisions with a lot of thought. And if it was a questionable something, he knew people could come to him and say, I could do A or B or C. I'm leaning towards B for this reason. Tell me if you agree.
Right.
And that type of thing is something that he was exceptional at. I think the one thing that I remember most about Steve Mack that I'll carry with me the rest of my life, in most organizations, when someone is exercised or angry or wants to make a point, they raise their voice to get people's attention. And Steve Mack never raised his voice for that. He always whispered. What I saw with that is that when his voice went down, people drew in because they didn't want to miss a word of what he was saying. He would only use that loud megaphonic voice when he needed some humor or a little comic relief in the room. And I found that right there was magic. He was right the opposite of what you would normally think. He would whisper when it was time to make an important point, and he would use that megaphonic voice of his to get the room rolling on the floor in laughter.
Bruce, you and I have been together for a long time as well, and we talk about him a lot, and he's one of those that I miss every day and think about every day, about his influences in my life.
When Dan Garrison came in and when I was made an officer, I walked to Steve's office and he looked at me and he basically said, "Don't say it. It's not me." He's like, "It's because of you. It's not me." And I was like, "No, that's just not true." Yeah. So he knew what I was going to say. He was passionate about MIM, and we were just beginning to roll out MIM, and he wanted people to use it. He wanted it in the location. He wanted the movies playing in the staterooms. We were sitting one night in his office, and he said, if there's a movie that's playing in a stateroom, you see a family that looks totally different than if you go into a stateroom and there isn't one. He said, if you go in a stateroom and there isn't one, you have people that are overwhelmed with grief and sadness and loss and despair, and you can see it in their face. You can see it in their body language. You can see it. But if you go into a stateroom and you have the movie playing and you hear them talking different and their body language is different and everything is different. So he was talking about that one night. So it was about 6 months later, he and I are in Lubbock, Texas, and we walk into Rest Haven. The management team there were 6 or 8 people that were there to meet and greet us, and they wanted to show us the facility. And they're walking us through the building. We come down the hallway where the staterooms are. He turned and looked, and inside this stateroom was a group of people, and they had a MIM that was playing in there. The video was playing. And now, mind you, there's probably 8 or 10 of us that are standing in the hallway. And we stood there and looked into the stateroom for a few minutes, and then we started walking down the hall. As we started walking down the hall, he was at the front, and I was at the back, and there were 6 or 8 people in between us. And he turned and glanced back at me. And that glance was him saying,
"I told you so."
I told you so. Yeah. This is exactly what it was. I told you that's how it is. Yeah. And he had this nonverbal communication that a glance, a look, he might pull his glasses down, and I knew exactly what he meant.
A lot of opportunities came my way based on my relationship with Steve.
I never met a Steve Mack enemy, ever. Yeah. Through the associates that he was engaged with, friends, anybody who ever met him, he had this engaging smile, ability to let people come into his world. And it was just inspirational every day and every minute that you were around him, every opportunity you got to talk to him. The days that you and I spent together with him were very, very meaningful, as well as the others that we had an opportunity to do that.
We were at a meeting in Peachtree City during my early days working for Steve. It was a big meeting, and all the middle market leaders were there. We were celebrating a great year, but we were also there to plan for the next year. And we met with our market leaders to come up with our growth plans for the next year. Putting those together was quite a process. There was math involved and personal commitments. Steve would hold us accountable to our commitments, and we knew it. At the end of the last day, each of the managing directors had to present the plans they had put together with their market leaders to the big group to make sure we met our required targets. Those were not easy days. If you were submitting pie-in-the-sky goals, Steve and the others could see through it, and you would lose credibility if you did not deliver. If your plan did not get your business unit to where you had to be, you'd be considered as someone who couldn't get the job done. Those could be tense presentations and could be boring to the casual observer whose livelihood was not on the line. Steve always ended those kind of meetings with an inspiring and challenging speech. He was very good at that, and I can tell you when you left the meeting, you'd be ready to run through a brick wall for it. Those were important speeches. The first day of the meeting, Steve had asked me if I'd be willing to say a few words to the group to challenge them if the right opportunity came up. I was shocked at that, but obviously said I would. By the last day, I'd figured that opportunity never would come up. As he was ending that final speech, he was talking about that we should never give up, no matter what obstacles we may face. Then all of a sudden, he stopped, and he called me to the stage to say a few words to end the meeting. I almost fell out of my chair. That was a big deal. I remember receiving a standing ovation that day after I finished. Steve was the first person who stood. My takeaway from that meeting would have a monumental impact on my career. I knew at that moment he trusted me, and I would spend the rest of my career working to develop people who could be trusted. And I knew I could do that only as I empowered them and set them free to use their God-given gifts. Maybe the greatest lesson I learned from him. Talk a little bit about what you saw, John, in his leadership style and the impact that had on you. And you were there before him. He worked for you for a while, and then he moved on up. What did you see in his leadership that made him so effective and impactful in your own career?
He would always try to bring out the best in people. Whatever point they were, in their career and the way they dealt with things, he would always work on having them become a leader that would find the best in people and bring out what that was. And that was something he did very well.
He was a ton of fun to be around, inspirational, but really taught me two very fundamental management philosophies. One was to always listen and display the proper spirit of humility. And what that means to me is you've got to understand other people's perspective and respect it and listen to it and may or may agree with it, but digest it. In the listening capacity, he said, listen to what they're saying. Do not respond. Take it all in, absorb it, think, and count to 10, and then give your answer.
Right.
So he taught you some really, really fundamental management and leadership, I should say, promises that really inspired me for the, close to 50 years I've been with the company now.
Wow.
His leadership came shining through during 9/11, and how that was so personal to him as a New Yorker. And yet he was the heart and soul of our company and kept people grounded and focused on what we do every day and why we do it. He had integrity, and he was always transparent. He taught me a lot about leadership, and he'd say, Vern, just ask more questions. That's what you need to do. Don't have all the answers. Ask more questions. And then when you think you've got all the answers because you've asked enough questions, ask some more questions. I loved hearing the stories about how he would spray scent on Barbara's pillows in her bedroom. I mean, what a touch. He was a gentleman a gentleman. I saw him on numerous occasions if we would have a business dinner and one of our female employees would be there, and we'd walk out. He'd say, "Let me walk you to your car."
Yeah.
Never let a female employee walk to her car alone.
Yeah.
He led from the front. He never sat on the sidelines. He never stayed in his office when there was work to be done or problems to be solved or issues to be ironed out. Steve led from the front, and he realized that unless he led from the front, that was going to be hard to get others to follow. You recall Steve had some pretty tough areas that were pretty set in their ways, and he had to really lean into it often in order to get people to do what needs to be done. So he was a leader in every respect, and he always led from the front, never from the rear.
Talk about a little bit about his dying and his death, because he, just like he lived, he died with much grace. But just talk about what you saw in him as he was working those last days or months, knowing that end was probably happening, and then actually when it finally happened. Just talk a little bit about that. That's what we do, and I think it's important for people to hear a perspective from somebody that was in the inner circle there.
Well, I tell you, the thing that, he batted it back once, and his daughter Kate was to be married in a few months, and they actually went in and did the surgery, removed the tumor, treated it, and pretty much had it, I wouldn't say cured, but had it batted back. And because he always said the only thing he ever wanted to do before he died was walk his daughter down the aisle. And he did that. And he did that with incredible grace. And I have pictures of Steve at that wedding, and he had such a joyous look on his face. He comes back to work a few months later and goes in for a scan, and it has reappeared. And he knew at that stage that he needed to get his house in order. He knew the implications and consequences. But he still came to the office every day that he could. And there came a point where he became immobilized and was in a wheelchair. I remember Barbara taking him to a middle market meeting at a hotel over in the Galleria to speak. And I still have that on tape. I think that was the last time that Steve Mack actually spoke before he went into, basically a comatose state.
Right.
And because he wanted people to know that there was work still to be done, and even though I may not be here, I'm counting on you guys to get it done. He spoke from his wheelchair, got a standing ovation, and I think that's the last time that Steve Mack actually spoke before he passed some 2 or 3 months later.
Vern, I know you were on that call that day when he called to tell us that he had the glioblastoma, and I'll never forget that conversation. I remember Googling it, sitting there while he was talking, and I knew that he had trouble. I'll never forget what he said. We didn't know what to say. None of us knew. It was quiet, and somebody asked him, it may have been me, what do you think, or how do you feel? He said, well, I'm not going to have a ticker tape parade around here, I can tell you that. You remember him saying that?
I do.
He died so gracefully. Gigi even kept going to his house and would work from there when he was in a hospital bed. Just talk about what you saw in him as he was leaving this world.
It gets emotional thinking about it. I remember exactly where I was. I had been in northern Michigan playing golf with Batesville, and I was on my way home driving, and Steve, had scheduled a call. So we got on the call, and I figured it would just be a call. And when he said that, I had to pull over and, gather myself. It was just a blow.
Yep.
Because he's larger than life, and, you just never really thought about what the world would be like without him.
Right.
And I had another Pisano story. Pisano and I were in Houston, and Steve was he wasn't in bed yet, but he was in a wheelchair. He wasn't walking, and Bob and I went over to visit him, and he said, maybe we ought to have a cigar. I don't know whether I've got any. And of course, I had a couple, two, because Steve always said a real gentleman always has two cigars, one for himself and one to share with a friend. So I had two cigars. We cut one in half. And, I got half, Bob got half, and Steve got one. And we sat out on his deck with Barbara and Kate and smoked a cigar. The last time I saw him, we were at a marketing meeting in Las Vegas, and I was with O'Brien, and I can't remember who all was there, but at the dinner the night before we left, Bill and I sat next to each other, and I said to Bill, I said, I really feel like I want to see Steve. This was probably in February, and he died in March. Right. I really feel like I want to see Steve, but I don't know how to do it. And he said, I'm going to see him tomorrow. Come back to Houston with me, and we'll go together. And I said, okay. So I got a lift with the guys going back to Houston, and Bill picked me up. We drove over to Steve's house. Then he was in bed. He was barely audible. I think he was in hospice at that point, and he was in the last month of his life. And Bill gave him communion, and the three of us sat in his room and prayed with him and held his hand. And it was, it was a moment I'll never forget.
A few months before Steve died, Kathy and I were in Houston. Steve had been admitted to MD Anderson Hospital, and we'd heard about it and was not doing well. But when we got to his floor of the hospital, the nurse told us his wife had gone downstairs to get something to eat, she thought. We were trying to decide whether to wait on Barbara or to go on in or whatever, and we were standing at the door when a nurse opened the door to come out. I was standing at the door when it opened. They were obviously changing the bed sheets on Steve's bed. They had Steve on his side, and he was facing me. I knew he saw me. I'd not seen him in several months, and I was shocked, to say the least. I'm sure Steve could see that on my face. We quickly stepped back in the hall, and the nurse came out and told us to give him a few minutes, but Steve wanted to see us. When they were finished and told us to come in, Kathy and I walked up to his bed. I really did not know what to say. This bigger-than-life man who had impacted so many and impacted me so much was so vulnerable and helpless. I awkwardly asked him how he was doing. His speech was weak, and we almost could not understand him. He was obviously not well. Having no idea what to say, I asked him if I could say a prayer for him. Kathy and I moved closer to the bed, and I put my hand on his hand and gave him what was a very weak attempt to pray for this incredible human being. I saw tears coming down his cheeks, and tears were dropping from my eyes. When I ended the prayer, I realized that Barbara had come in the room while I was praying. Steve thanked me and told me the doctor told him he had only a 5% chance to live. Barbara walked up to the bed and said in a gentle way, "Steve, I thought the doctor this morning said you had a 10% chance to live." I replied, I think Steve decided his chances had been cut in half after my prayer. As sick as he was, Steve laughed, and he laughed. It was the same laugh I'd seen many times before, and it did my heart good. This was the last time I saw him alive. I told that story at his funeral in Houston a few months later. I recollected the first time I met him and the last time I saw him. I had come full circle with Steve Mack. One word, or maybe you got two words or phrases. When you think of Steve, what is that?
Passionate about life. He was passionate about his family that he loved dearly, and he was passionate about the people he worked with and the company that he loved dearly. And he put everything he had into those things all the time.
What an extremely intelligent individual. His perception of things and how they turn out and what to do, when, where, and how, and in difficult times, he always seemed to have the answer. And he did it in a very, very gentle way.
In a personal way, it is gentleman. He was always a gentleman. Professionally, intentional. He was never unintentional about what he said or how he did what he did.
Champion. That's a champion not only for this profession, for his family, and for those that worked with him and for him. He was just a champion. Everything that he was involved in, he wanted to make a difference, and he did.
Love. His love for his family, his love for his associates that he was privileged to work with, his love for the company, SCI, and what they afforded him, the opportunity, his friends. He always had this glowing respect for people,
Right.
and his passion to deliver quality service throughout the organization. I just walked into our pantry and I have his photo tacked up to the wall. And it's the prayer card that was given to us at his passing, Stephen Michael Mack. And I go in there on every morning just to be inspired to go and do what I do each and every day and remember his legacy and what he taught me. This was his favorite saying. You can get almost anything done if you don't care who gets the credit for it. And that's on the back of that picture.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.